Good morning to all of you, and welcome to those of you in the audience as well as those watching on webcast. My name is Louise Shaner, and I'm the Policy Director here at the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at Brookings. Our goals at Hutchins are to both improve public understanding of fiscal and monetary policies and to be a place that gathers people from academia, government, and business to try to improve those policies. Today, we will hopefully meet both those goals. I should note that many of the presentations that you're going to see today and the papers behind them are available on the Brookings webpage for this event. Okay. We're all really excited about today's conference, both because we think behavioral economics has the potential to greatly improve public policy and because, frankly, it's so much fun to think about. Our mission was to find scholars doing interesting work across a very broad range of policy areas. So we'll hear today about how employers can get workers to improve their health and increase retirement savings, how consumers are misled by financial advisors, and how governments can boost labor force participation and improve the quality of health care. We'll also hear about how taxpayers don't seem to respond to changes in taxes in ways that fit the predictions of most of our standard models. I think this finding highlights the broader implications of behavioral economics, which is that it may ultimately force us to rethink some of economics' most widely held beliefs. Our lunchtime speaker will be Maya Shankar from the Social and Behavioral Sciences team at the White House, basically the U.S.'s nudge unit. She'll review the findings from a report released just this week that assesses the team's first-year efforts to apply behavioral insights to improve federal policies and programs. Interestingly, the Social and Behavioral Sciences team had its start, at least in part, here at Brookings. In May of 2013, Brookings hosted one of the 3 meetings held between the White House, a number of agencies, and outside experts that set up Maya's office and proposed some of the first trials. The meeting at Brookings was focused on electronic billing and financial protection. So we are more than pleased to have Maya back at Brookings today to report on what has been learned. We're also thrilled to kick off our event with a keynote address by Raj Chetty, now of Stanford University. I hear the congratulations are in order for Raj, not for his move to Stanford, but because his wife just had a baby, so mazel tov. So it's especially kind of him to be here today to introduce us to the powerful insights of behavioral economics. Raj?
Great, thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much to the Hutchins Center here at Brookings for drawing a spotlight to behavioral economics here in DC. So I'd like to talk today about how behavioral economics is increasingly making very important contributions to public policy. And I'm going to classify these contributions into 2 categories. So what we as economists would call positive analysis, that is making better empirical predictions about the effects of existing policies and identifying new policy tools. And second, normative analysis, that is developing new prescriptions for optimal policy design. And so what I'll argue in the talk today is that I think behavioral economics has been and will continue to be very successful in this first domain of positive analysis. But there are many challenges that remain to be resolved in the second domain. I think we're starting to make progress on that front, but there's a lot left to do. So I'm going to illustrate the positive and normative implications of behavioral economics for public policy using 2 applications. First, the effect of taxes on worker behavior, as Louise just talked about. And second, some more recent work I'm doing with my colleagues on neighborhood choice and upward mobility. What I'm going to talk about today is an excerpt of the Ely lecture that I gave at the American Economic Association meetings earlier this year. And for those of you who are interested, you can read more about this in the article that was published in the May AER. So let me start with the first application on predicting the effects of the Earned Income Tax Credit on worker behavior. As many of you will know, the EITC is one of the largest anti-poverty programs in the US. We spend about $60 billion per year on the EITC. And the way it works is that we give people a 40% subsidy, roughly, for earnings up to an income of $12,600. So every dollar you earn, the government gives you 40 cents. And the precise parameters of that vary with the number of kids you have and family structure and so forth. And then once you reach this income of roughly $12,600, the credit is phased out, and gradually as you earn more and more, you're no longer eligible for the EITC. Now, the EITC was expanded to its current form under the Clinton administration in 1996 as part of an effort to increase the return to working for families. And so naturally, a key policy question is whether it's been successful in achieving that goal. Has the EITC, in fact, increased the amount that low-income families work? So in recent work with my colleagues John Friedman and Emmanuel Saez, we set about trying to tackle that question using new data from de-identified federal income tax returns covering the entire US population from 1996 to 2009. So this is an illustration of much of recent empirical work in economics, which draws upon very large data sets to tackle policy questions like this. In this case, we're using data on 78 million taxpayers and have 1.1 billion observations on income in the results that I'm going to show you. So our initial research plan, which I think the reason I talk about this, it gives you a sense of how behavioral economics influences traditional economic thinking and makes us revisit our assumptions. So our initial plan in coming to this paper had nothing to do with behavioral economics at all. What we thought we'd do is exploit differences across states in top-up EITC policies. So for example, Wisconsin adds an additional 40% subsidy relative to the federal subsidy, whereas other states like Illinois or Texas don't do that. So we thought, okay, we're going to exploit the state-level variation and try to figure out if the EITC seems to matter. So what we started with was just examining what income distributions look like across states in the US. And so let me give you an example. This is what the distribution of taxable income looks like for all EITC claimants in Texas. So this is in $1,000 income bins. It's just showing you a histogram, the percentage of tax filers in each $1,000 income bin. And the red line denotes the point where you maximize your EITC refund, where you get the biggest check from the government by reporting that level of income. And what you see is a very clear pattern of sharp bunching at that refund maximizing point. That is, a bunch of people have figured out that if you write down $12,600 on your tax return, you're going to get the biggest check from the government. And so lots of people report an income of exactly that amount in Texas. Now, it turns out if you do the same analysis in another state, let's take the example of Kansas, you find much less of a spike at that refund maximizing point. Now, critically, your incentives aren't different in Texas and Kansas. Neither of these states has state EITCs. They both have essentially the same incentives created by the federal program. So it's kind of curious and interesting that there seems to be much more of a behavioral response, much more sharp bunching in Texas than in Kansas. So motivated by this type of finding, we then decided to explore more carefully what was going on across areas in the US in terms of the degree of this sharp bunching behavioral response, reporting income exactly at the refund maximizing point. So this map here essentially shows a statistic, which is what fraction of people report an income exactly at that red line in each 3-digit zip code in the US. So we break the US up into about 900 geographical areas based on the first 3 digits of the zip code. And in each of those zip codes, we're computing the fraction of people who report the EITC refund maximizing amount on their tax return. Now, this map is colored so that lighter colored areas are areas where people are responding less to the EITC, all right? So there are fewer people reporting the refund maximizing amount. And I'm starting by showing you data in 1996, which is the year that the program really became the way it is today, of the scale that it is today. And what you see here in 1996 is that most of the US looks very light. Not a lot of people are responding very much, except for a few exceptions, such as, for instance, the southern tip of Texas. Notice that it's dark red. There's quite a bit of response in Texas, even in that first year in 1996. So now let's look at the evolution of the response to the EITC over time in the US. So this is what the pattern looks like in 99, 2002, 2005, and 2008. So the pattern you see is that it sort of looks like the behavioral response to the EITC is spreading from the southern tip of Texas, sort of emanating from southern Texas to the rest of the United States over a 15-year period, right, over quite a long period since the program was initially took its current form. So this pattern led us to then investigate, why does the impact of the EITC vary so much across areas in ways that have nothing to do with the hypothesis we came into this with, which is that it's about differences in tax incentives across places. And this naturally led us to think about a plausible behavioral model, especially in light of that spatial diffusion pattern that I just showed you, which is that maybe this is about differences in knowledge about the EITC, differences in information. So to test that explanation, we did a simple thing. We looked at people who moved across areas. The reason we looked at movers is because the knowledge model, differences in information, makes a very specific prediction about how moving should affect behavior. Moving to a higher bunching area, so for instance, from Kansas to Texas, should increase the amount that people respond to the EITC as they learn about the EITC from their neighbors, et cetera. But moving from Texas to Kansas, as long as you have memory, should not affect the amount that you respond to the program because you learned about the EITC already and you can continue to apply that knowledge in Kansas. So strikingly, we find exactly that pattern in the data. So this chart here on the x-axis shows you the change in the level of sharp bunching among the prior residents in the area to which you move relative to the area from which you move. So for example, on the far right of this chart are people who are moving from Kansas to Texas. They're moving to places where people were responding more. And on the far left are people who are moving to places where the prior residents were responding much less. And what we're plotting is the change in the EITC refund amount that people got after the move relative to before the move. So the idea is that if you start to respond more yourself, you're going to get a bigger EITC refund. And so what you see is when you move to a higher bunching area on the right side of this graph, you start to get a larger EITC refund. That is, you're changing your reported earnings so that you're closer to that refund maximizing point of the schedule. But when you move to a lower bunching area on the left, there's no change at all, exactly as you would expect in a knowledge and learning model. Moving up increases the refund, but moving down has no impact. So what these results show is that differences in knowledge seem to play a significant role in the reported income that people report to the IRS as induced by the EITC. However, I want to make an important point that's relevant for policy here, which is that the sharp bunching at the refund maximizing kink that I've been talking about is driven primarily by self-employed individuals who are manipulating the reported income. So we see from audit studies and other evidence that most of this very sharp response, like we saw in that Texas graph, is just a reporting effect, that people know that if they list an income of $12,600 instead of $7,000, it's very hard for the IRS to audit self-employment income, and that way you can get a bigger refund from the government. So that's fine. It's kind of interesting to document that behavioral response, but the purpose of the EITC is not just to get people to write different numbers on their income tax returns, right? You actually are trying to change the amount that people work. And so the deeper question, in my view, from a policy perspective, is whether the EITC actually affects real work decisions. And so in order to study that, we analyze the impacts on wage earnings, excluding self-employment income. So the idea here is we're going to take data on wage earnings directly from W-2s, and it's very hard to manipulate reported earnings on W-2s, right? Because your employer, especially if we restrict to big employers like Walmart, they're very unlikely to manipulate what they put on a W-2. So this next chart here shows you the distribution of W-2 wage earnings in areas that we're going to call low information, areas like Kansas with very low levels of sharp self-employment bunching. So that's in the blue. And then in the red are areas that we're going to call high information, places like southern Texas, where a lot of self-employed people seem to be responding to the EITC. And the pattern you see here is that the wage earnings distribution is much more concentrated in that $10,000 to $15,000 range, where people get large EITC refunds, in the high information areas relative to the low information areas, showing that even the wage earners, the ones who are not manipulating the reported income, appear to be working different amounts when they're aware of the EITC. So notice that the response is not nearly as sharp as it was for the self-employed. It's not exactly at like the $12,000 level, but that makes a lot of sense, right? If you think about somebody working at Walmart, you're not going to be able to go to your boss and say, I want to work exactly 37 hours a week so that I can get my income to $12,600, you'd expect the response to be more diffuse. And that's exactly what you see in the red relative to the blue. So building on this type of analysis, we find that the EITC primarily induces increases in earnings in the phase-in region of the program rather than reductions in earnings in the phase-out region. So that's very encouraging because it suggests that, in fact, the EITC is very effective in increasing labor supply. But it's effective only in places where people seem to really know about the program and understand the program. And what are those places? There are places with dense EITC populations, for example. So if you live in an apartment building where lots of other people are EITC recipients, you're more likely to have heard about the program, know about how it works, and you make decisions accordingly that maximize the size of your refund. If you're in a place where very few people know about the program, you're much less responsive. So the broader lesson here, echoing, I think, exactly what Louise pointed out at the beginning, is that incorporating behavioral features into the model helps us better predict the impacts of important existing tax policies like the EITC. Now, more broadly, behavioral insights can also yield new policy tools that can be used to achieve better outcomes. So for instance, in the context of the EITC, in light of these findings, you might think about a policy proposal where we could include the EITC payment in the wage that people receive in order to eliminate these information issues. So rather than being quoted an hourly wage of $10 an hour from your employer, you'd actually see a wage of $14 an hour. Now, there are issues in implementing that given that we have an annual income tax system, but it's the type of policy change that could have a big effect in light of these findings that information seems to matter. I think perhaps the most influential example of a new policy tool that has an impact on behavior is the use of defaults to increase retirement savings. And this is something David Leibson has been done a lot of work on. We'll talk about later today. There's a lot of literature that suggests that defaults are far more effective in raising total savings than traditional tools like changes in tax subsidies like IRAs or 401ks. So in addition to better predicting the effects of existing policies, I think behavioral economics can be quite valuable in identifying new policies. So let me now, in the remaining time, turn to a second application on neighborhood choices and upward mobility, where I'll focus more on the normative or prescriptive aspects of behavioral economics rather than the positive aspects as I've done up to now. So to motivate this, I'm going to start from the fact that recent work shows that where families choose to live greatly influences their children's prospects for moving up in the income distribution. And let me illustrate that with a local example, showing you the geography of upward mobility here in the DC metro area. So what this map shows you is the probability that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution makes the leap all the way to the top fifth of the income distribution. So a simple statistic to measure upward mobility. And we're doing this by county. We compute these statistics for all counties in the US. And here I'm showing you a set of counties around DC and Baltimore. And lighter colored areas are areas with higher levels of upward mobility. So what you can see is even within this one metro area, there's a striking amount of variation in rates of upward mobility. So you take the city of Baltimore, turns out to be the place among large counties that is lowest in rates of upward mobility in the entire US, where if you're born to a family in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, you have only a 3% chance of making it to the top fifth. That compares with 4.5% in DC itself, 9.2% in Prince George's County, 14% in Charles County. So these are really vast differences in children's prospects of moving up in the income distribution and achieving the American dream. Now, moreover, these differences that I've just shown you, based on further work that we've done with Nathan Hendren and Larry Katz, appear to be primarily due to the causal effects of place. So it's not that the people living in Baltimore are different from the people living in DC or in Prince George's County. It's actually that if you move a child out of Baltimore or into Baltimore, you see different outcomes for those kids. So as one example of that, the famous Moving to Opportunity experiment, in a reanalysis of that data, we find that moving to a low poverty census tract at a young age can increase your earnings in adulthood by something like 30%. So quite dramatic impacts on kids' long-term outcomes based on where they live. Now, furthermore, we find that moving to a high opportunity area, for instance, a low poverty neighborhood, has little impact on adults' earnings. And In addition, many of these high opportunity areas, the lighter colored areas on that map, are not necessarily more expensive in terms of housing costs or transportation costs than the darker colored areas. So putting together all those facts, you have sort of a puzzle, right? There seem to be these places that offer much better opportunities for kids, and they're not significantly more expensive. So what can we make of that for policy? Should we be trying to influence families to move to areas that offer higher levels of upward mobility? I think this is actually an extremely important policy question, one that'll receive a lot of attention in the coming years, given the apparent importance of neighborhood effects for upward mobility. So the traditional economic model has a very clear answer to that question. It says that despite the evidence I've just shown you, you should not intervene. The logic is very simple. People optimize for themselves. So even though we're seeing these differences in children's outcomes across areas, apparently there must be other things, the traditional model would say, if people are optimizing, there must be other things that people value independent of upward mobility that vary across these places. So for instance, maybe people want to stay in a lower opportunity area because it's closer to where they work or closer to their friends or has some other amenities that they value. And if people optimize, the government shouldn't be in the business of trying to steer you towards those lighter colored areas. Behavioral economics suggests a very different view. It suggests that families might actually be making mistakes in choosing to stay in low opportunity areas like Baltimore for a host of different reasons. So as one example, families might have status quo or present bias. So this is a situation where the gains for kids in terms of higher earnings are realized with a delay of 10 or 20 years after you move to that different neighborhood. But the costs of making that move, of course, are paid up front. So if you're myopic or you're present biased in the style of work that David Leibson has done in hyperbolic discounting, that's going to create a situation where you overweigh the cost relative to the benefits that you get much later, and you might sort of incorrectly, from a welfare point of view, stay in a neighborhood that's not good for your kids. Another force that pushes in this direction is recent work by Senthil Mullainathan and Elder Shafir and others, which suggests that extreme poverty of the type that people, for example, in the projects in Baltimore experience, increases people's focus on immediate needs, where you're really trying to survive day to day and you're not making these long-term plans about how your kids will do 20 years from now. Once again, that might lead people to misoptimize and not put enough weight on the future. A third possibility is, once again, a lack of information. Maybe you don't know where these high opportunity neighborhoods are unless you take a look at data like this. So under this behavioral economics view, subsidies such as housing vouchers or nudges like counseling to move families to higher opportunity areas could increase welfare substantially. Now, the key question, of course, is how we determine whether the traditional view or the behavioral view of neighborhood choice is correct. So is it that families are making the right choice in staying in these lower opportunity areas, or are they making a mistake for the various reasons that I've pointed out? We don't want to just take the paternalistic approach of assuming that the government knows more about where people should live than they themselves know. So I think the key conceptual challenge, and this is what I want to end with, is that we need to identify individuals' experienced utility, that is how they actually feel from living in different neighborhoods. And that's a very difficult thing to do. So let me just briefly explain what recent work has done in order to try to identify individuals' true experienced utility. So there are a number of different approaches that people have tried to pursue. One possibility is just to use surveys of happiness or well-being after people move. So do people who move to these higher opportunity areas, do they actually seem to have higher levels of well-being? Another approach is to try to find a domain where people are not making mistakes. So for instance, suppose you think the main problem here is information. You could try to provide clear information about the effects of living in different neighborhoods and then look at what people choose to do. A third possibility is to try to build a model of why people are making mistakes. So for instance, if it's discounting issues, you might use a hyperbolic discounting model and try to estimate the parameters of that model. I think all of these approaches are very promising, but there is no definitive systematic solution yet. And so it's unclear, particularly in this context, whether and how we should be encouraging families to move to different neighborhoods. Now, I want to stress that although this is an unresolved issue, we're implicitly taking a stance on this in current policy decisions. It's critical for policy analysis because at the moment we spend about $40 billion a year on various affordable housing policies in the US, and we're implicitly making a judgment on exactly these issues. So it's very important to resolve this problem. So let me conclude by just noting that behavioral economics has and I think will continue to greatly enrich our understanding of the effects of existing and new economic policies. And I think the talks you'll see today will provide many great examples of this work. But I'd ask you to keep in mind the key challenge that we face in understanding the implications of these new data for making policy prescriptions. We need to develop better tools to determine what people who make mistakes would really prefer to do themselves if they were optimizing correctly. So as another example, in the retirement savings context, which you're going to hear about, we'll see that defaults and other alternative policy tools matter a lot. The challenging question is to figure out what the optimal default is. How much should we be encouraging people to save? In the end, I think there are very big rewards from solving these problems and doing further research on these questions because the policies that facilitate these optimal choices could greatly increase economic welfare at low cost. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. So I just want to introduce our speakers for this first panel. I'm going to introduce all three of them right now so I don't have to keep coming up. So our first speaker is Olivia Mitchell from the University of Pennsylvania. Our second speaker is Naomi Feldman, a former colleague of mine from the Federal Reserve Board. And our third speaker is Johannes Schmieder from Boston University. So thanks very much, Olivia.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be included in this august group today. So thanks a lot, Louise and the Hutchins Center, and of course, Brookings. This is research I'm delighted to be speaking on, which I've been working on for several years with Raymond Maurer, a colleague of mine from Germany, from Frankfurt, and a couple of his students. And the context is one in which, of course, we realize that Social Security as a system in the U.S. is going to be running short of cash. It's already paying out more in benefits than it's taking in payroll taxes. But many of the reforms that people have discussed seem quite unpalatable, like cutting benefits or maybe even raising the early retirement age, the later retirement age. And so what we've been trying to do is think about giving people options instead of taking away options, thereby potentially getting them to work longer and maybe even saving the system some money. So with that, I know in this august group, there are a lot of people that know a lot about Social Security. I'll just quickly review some of the key elements for those of you that are tax people or health people. So I'm going to be talking primarily about the old age and survivors and disability insurance, actually primarily the retirement piece, the old age piece. And as you probably know, the benefits are progressive. For people that don't earn very much, they get a much higher replacement rate. For people that earn more, they get a lower replacement rate at the margin. And it's based on your average 35 years best earnings history. Now, you probably also know that you can claim the benefit anywhere between age 62 and age 70. What many people have not focused on, however, is the fact that you get roughly an actuarially fair increment every year you delay. So, for example, if you claim your benefit at your full retirement age, and given everyone in this room is so young, your full retirement age is probably 67. If you claim earlier than that at 62, you get a benefit reduction for every year you claim early, between 5 and 7% per year. And if you delay from 67 on to 70, you get about another 8% a year. So in fact, if you think about delaying from 62 to 70, you get about a 76% increment in your benefit once you claim the rest of your life. Now, with a footnote, a caveat, the Social Security Administration has been calculating these increments to be roughly actuarially fair. That is, because when you claim the benefit later, you get more per year, but you get it over fewer years. So in present value, it's about the same. But a lot of people just don't realize that they get a very big return from delaying claiming a year. And we would argue that when you claim your Social Security benefit, it could well be the most important financial decision that you and your household will make in the world, in life. So our question, maybe not in the world, but in life. So our question is, what if you gave people the opportunity to delay claiming their Social Security benefit, but instead of giving them their benefit boost as just an extra bit in their monthly check, instead you gave them a lump sum once they hit that delayed benefit age? Would they like to take the lump sum versus the higher annuity? And if possible, would they like to continue working? If they did continue working, this would potentially be beneficial to the Social Security system because they'd keep on paying taxes, and it might be beneficial to them since recent research has suggested that the longer you keep working, the better off you'll be health-wise. So that's the question that we're looking at. Now, why might people think about delaying claiming if you offer them a lump sum instead of a higher benefit the rest of their life? Well, maybe they're risk averse, and most of us don't know when we're going to die, and maybe a lump sum seems more attractive than the promise of a lifetime additional annuity. Maybe you're not sure about the political situation. We don't know what will happen when the system runs short of money, and a lump sum might seem more attractive than delaying long. So there could be lots of good reasons that people would prefer a lump sum over the actuarially fair annuity. And as I said, it could possibly help a little bit. Now, here's just an illustration of the extra money you would get if you thought about delaying your benefit, say, from 62 to 63. I don't think this works on this screen. You'd get a benefit increase from 62 to 63 of about 7% more per year. If you waited until you were 70, it's about 75% more. So this is obviously a big number. What we did in this particular study was to present two different claiming alternatives to people. The status quo is roughly what's represented here for someone, say, who had a full retirement age of 67 and whose monthly benefit, if he or she retired at 62, was about $1,500 a month. So that's the status quo in the column labeled status quo. Now, if, however, you said to the person, hey, I'll give you your increment if you delay claiming in the form not of an increase in your monthly benefit. I'll give you the exact same monthly benefit you would have gotten anyway at 62, but I give you the increment in the form of a lump sum. So for example, you can see here, if the person delayed to 67, he or she would still get the $1,500 a month in the benefit check. But now, good heavens, $108, almost $9,000. And so that's a tiny piece of change that may well give people the incentive to keep working. The other alternative we presented was we said, well, this may be a little bit too expensive in the sense of it has a current cash flow impact. So what if we said to people, you'll get your benefit increment as you delay claiming every year up to your full retirement age 67. If you delay claiming after that, we'll give you the same monthly benefit you would have gotten, but we'll give you the lump sum. So the lump sums are obviously less, but still they're a substantial amount of money. So what we did in this study was we used the American Life Panel. Some of you are familiar with this. We surveyed expected claiming ages and work effort under the status quo and two lump sum alternatives. The American Life Panel is a survey of about 5,000 people. They do high-frequency online surveys. It's relatively representative. Low-income people got web access through laptops or what have you, so that it was more representative in that sense. And so here's really the setup. So we said, for the sake of these questions, assume you're currently age 62 and single. You're thinking about when to claim your Social Security benefit. And we had to explain to people what actuarially fair means, which is not so easy. So what we said was, You can claim your benefit any time between 62 and 70. On average, the system will neither lose nor make money. So that's what we're trying to get people to understand is you're not going to benefit the system either way, you get the same in expected value. If you claim your benefit at 62, you'll get $1,500 per life, and we figured out based on people's earnings histories what they would get, ran them through the calculator. Or we said you can move this little slider on the ruler here and figure out how much you would get if you claimed at some other age. So for example, if I picked 67 in 7 months, I would get $2,243. So that's kind of the status quo. Now, the alternative, we said, was you can get the status quo, or you move the slider again, and you can see you'll still get the initial monthly benefit, plus, if you pick 67 in 7 months, $123,000 at your lump sum, at your point when you actually claim and get the lump sum. So that was the first alternative. The second alternative was basically saying you don't get a lump sum until you claim at your delayed retirement age. And in the minute I have left, I'll just summarize my key findings. Basically, what we found is that people were quite responsive to this notion of getting a lump sum plus their base level benefit if you offered that to them by delaying claiming. You would probably raise the claiming age about 2 years, and people would work about 4 to 6 months more during that period. Obviously, the people that are most likely to change their behavior are the people that would have claimed the earliest anyway, because the folks that are already going to claim at 70 aren't going to get too much. So at the end of the day, what we concluded is that long work lives could be incentivized by taking advantage of people's desire to get a lump sum versus the life annuity. And it could be a politically viable way to reform Social Security. And you probably can't read this. The piggy bank on the left is talking to Social Security on the right. And the one on the Social Security system says, of course, I don't jingle. I'm full of red ink. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Louise and the Hutchins Center for the invitation. Let me first add that this is joint work with Laura Kawano at the Treasury and Peter Katuszczuk at Surge in Prague. This is our personal research, and anything I'm going to say here do not represent the views of the Federal Reserve Board or the Department of the Treasury. So I probably don't have to tell you that the U.S. income tax code is fairly complex. There are numerous academic papers in economics that investigate taxpayer responses to some detail of the tax code, and the implicit assumption is that people understand how tax changes impact their marginal tax rates. So this assumption is no longer taken as given, and there is a fairly large older literature on taxpayer confusion, so the idea that people will confuse their marginal tax rates with their average tax rates. And as Raj mentioned, there's a growing literature on tax salience and tax complexity. So what we do in our work is that we devise an empirical test to see whether people actually misperceive the tax liability changes that they face. So we think about 3 different types of households. So you can think of one type of household, which we call fully informed. And this is a household that understands the parameters of the tax schedule and anticipates future changes that can be foreseen and how they impact their tax liability. You could think of another type of household, which we call ex post informed. This is a household that does perhaps not anticipate fully future tax liability changes, but once they occur, they understand why they occurred. So they understand that the tax code ex post. The third type of household is what we call ex post confused. So these are households that do not anticipate future tax liability changes, and once they occur, they don't exactly understand how and why they occurred. Okay? So we want to sort of get at these 3 different types of households. And in order to do that, we identify a provision that generates a lump sum increase in tax liability, and this is the child tax credit. So let me first say this is different than the child tax deduction. This is a credit that you receive, and I'll say a little bit more about what this credit is in a second. So why do we like the CTC, the child tax credit?
The first is that it's broad-based. Virtually any household with dependents and labor income between $30,000 and $110,000 can take full advantage of the credit. It's lump sum. It does not impact the after-tax wage, and so it should not affect your labor supply on the margin. And its loss is predictable. It occurs in the year in which the child turns 17. So if you are a fully informed household, you should anticipate that you're going to lose this credit when your child turns 17, and it should have no impact on your labor supply and your behavior. So a child that turns 17 is no longer eligible for the credit, as I mentioned. So you can think about a child turning 17 in December, for example, of 2005, just becomes ineligible for tax year 2005. So if your child is born on December 31st, 2005, that's really a bad day to be born because you will lose the credit for the year. On the other hand, if your child will turn 17 on January 1st of 2006, you get to keep the credit for tax year 2005. So a January 1st child, or anyone born, in this case we're going to look at the whole month of January, has just retained eligibility for tax year 2005. So if you can think about some randomness in when your child is born, you can think of these December and January birth households as virtually identical, but for the loss of the CTC. Okay? So given that, January birth households provide a natural comparison group to December birth households when we're looking at behavior. So our empirical strategy is that we're going to compare parental labor supply in year T+1 for households with a child who was born in December of year T to their contemporaries for a child who was born in January of year T+1. Now, why do we look at labor supply in year T+1? Because households realize the increase in their tax liability upon filing taxes, which is typically done by April of year T+1 for tax year T. So our hypothesis is that households understand how the tax code is impacting them. There should be no impact in their behavior if they're fully informed. They understand that they're going to lose this credit when their child turns 17. They've anticipated that. They've adjusted their behavior ahead of time. And so there should be no impact on the margin. So one caveat here is that losing the credit does make a household feel poor. So if you did not fully anticipate that you were going to lose this credit, you might be inclined to actually work more. Okay? So these are what we call the ex post informed households. So our null hypothesis overall is that losing the credit either has no impact if you're fully informed, or it might have a positive impact if you now feel poorer and feel the need to actually work more. On the other hand, if you're confused, households might confuse this lump sum increase in their tax liability with an increase in their marginal tax rate. Given this, we might see some decrease in labor supply, okay, because they might think their marginal tax rates have gone up, and therefore this would have a negative effect on the amount that they choose to work. So this is the CTC schedule for 2 children. There's a fairly steep phase-in and a fairly steep phase-out. We're going to focus on this region, as I mentioned, between 30,000 and 110,000, where all of these households are receiving the full credit and its lump sum. Okay. So the data that we use is IRS population-based administrative tax return data. We identify children who turned 17 in either December or January between 2004 and 2011 from Social Security records. We then match those children to the parents who claim them as dependents on their tax returns. We're going to restrict attention to parents who are married couples filing jointly, and this gives us about 850,000 observations over those years. So just to give you an idea of what I'm plotting here, so these are 3 different years, year T-1, year T, and T+1. Each little circle represents the average child tax credit for households with a child born on that day. So you can think about sort of on the far left side of the graph, the first circle will represent the average child tax credit for households that have a child born on December 1st. And the line in the middle represents January 1st. Okay, so those on the left side of the line in each graph are those households with children born in December, and each dot represents a day in December. And on the right side of the line, I'm sorry. On the right side of the line represents households with a child born in January. Okay, and again, each dot represents the average child tax credit for a child born on January 1st, 2nd, 3rd, et cetera, through the entire month. So what you can see here is that in year T-1, both December and January birth households are collecting the CTC in 2004, again, for example, for children under the age of 17. Okay, so on average, households have a little under 2 children, and so they're collecting the credit for their children. Suddenly, in year T, the December birth households have now lost one of their children as eligible for the credit. And so you could see that the difference between the December households and the January households is roughly about $1,000, which is the full value of the credit. Then come 2006, the January households have now themselves lost the credit, and so they once again look very similar. Okay? So again, the important graph is the one in the middle. Here, this is essentially our treatment effect. So you can see that December households are receiving roughly about $1,000 less in credit than the January households. So now I'm plotting wage and salary income. Again, the dots represent the exact same thing as before. These are the average wages and salaries for households born on December 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, et cetera, through the end of January. And the important thing here is to look, is there potentially any gap between households born in December and in January? So you could see in year T-1, again, everyone's receiving the credit. And so you can see there's no real gap between December and January birth households. Come in year T, again, there's a slight gap, but it's not statistically significant between December and January households. Then in year T+1, you could see that gap actually increases quite a bit. It's roughly about 0.5%. So this means that December birth households are earning roughly about 0.5% less than January birth households. And again, this is a negative effect. Okay, so this might suggest that households are working less. They're somehow confusing this lump sum increase in their tax liability with an increase in their marginal tax rates. So that was over the entire sample. That was the average effect. You can also think, well, maybe this effect actually differs by income or by other characteristics of the taxpayer. So here we plot, we re-estimate our model, and we're looking at different income bins. And so you can see here that the more negative the effect, that's the larger the difference is between December birth households and January birth households. And you could see that most of the effect is really focused upon the relatively lower income households in roughly the 30 to 55,000 bin. The effect starts to disappear as household income increases, and by the time you're reaching 80 to 100,000, it's pretty much zero, right? So represent there's no difference between December and January birth households, suggesting that higher income households are potentially less confused about this tax liability increase that they're facing. We also chopped up the data in a few other dimensions. The first is that we looked at households who were below and above the median age. Okay? And so again, here you could see that households that are above the median age, again, who are perhaps more experienced in filing taxes, have more interaction with the income tax code, appear to be less confused. And again, the important thing here is that these lines are actually crossing zero, meaning statistically speaking that we cannot reject that they're not confused at all. Self-employed households are less confused, and households with capital gains realizations appear to also to be less confused. So I'll just conclude here. Real-world tax schedules are complex, and taxpayers may confuse changes in the level for changes in the slope. We find robust evidence confusion over a fairly straightforward tax increase. Taking a baseline elasticity, how big is this 0.5%? We estimate roughly 1/4 to 1/2 of households confuse this lump sum increase in tax liability as an increase in their marginal rate. Though, given some of those heterogeneous responses that I showed you, we don't consider this behavior to be hardwired. There appears to be some evidence that it can be learned away with experience and exposure to the income tax code. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also delighted to be here. My name is Johannes Schmieder, and I'm going to talk today about unemployment insurance and what we can learn from behavioral economics about potentially improving the design of unemployment insurance. And I should mention this is joint work with Stefano Della Vigna from Berkeley, Attila Lindner, who is now actually at UCL, and Balázs Reiser at the Central European University. So if you think about unemployment insurance, it's certainly one of the major, probably the most important tool to help job losers, and has particularly gotten a lot of attention during the Great Recession when it was expanded to sort of unprecedented levels or durations in the US. And I think in economics, we've long been aware, and in the policy sphere as well, that there's a real trade-off here. On the one hand, UI benefits have a clear benefit by helping people who are in desperate needs for help to smooth their consumption drop during a spell of unemployment while they're looking for a new job. But it's also clear that there's a potential downside to that, namely that by giving people money conditional on not having a job, we're essentially providing a reason for them to look potentially less hard for a job. And at this point, it's very well documented in the empirical literature that there's a pretty sizable disincentive effect coming from unemployment benefits. And I think most of sort of the more traditional approach in economics to studying unemployment insurance has been about sort of measuring those two effects, the benefits and the cost, and then sort of finding the correct trade-off between the two. But behavioral economics kind of opens up a possibility for a third route how to approach this, namely, maybe this disincentive effect from unemployment insurance isn't just sort of a fixed variable for what the world has to be like. Maybe there's something we could potentially manipulate, and maybe we can use insights from behavioral economics to reduce this moral hazard effect, this disincentive effect that comes from unemployment insurance. Now, I think in at least ex ante, there's a clear reason why this may actually, there may be a lot of potential for this. And if you think about job loss, we know from research in psychology, as well from behavioral economics, that job loss is very traumatic. It's a very, it's a huge event in somebody's life. And then suddenly individuals who have often not searched for a job for a long time, maybe since they were out of college or school, suddenly they're faced with a very complex task at a very difficult point in their life. And there are a lot of difficult decisions about what the right trade-offs are, how much you should search, how should you search. And a lot of information is just not there. So the potential insight from behavioral economics can come in a variety of forms. And I think there are essentially two different approaches how one can go about them. So one is sort of a more model-based approach where I think it's in line with what Raj described as the positive perspective in economics, meaning we would like to use insights from behavioral economics to better understand how people act and sort of come up with better predictive models of human behavior. And then in this case about job search, and a lot of insights sort of coming from more basic research in behavioral economics that may be applicable to unemployment benefits. So for example, we know that people have self-control issues. Even if they want to search for a job, they may have a hard time getting up in the morning actually doing it because it's so painful to think about the fact that you're unemployed. We know about, there's a lot of evidence that people are really overconfident actually about the probability of finding a job. So if you ask people, how long will it take you to find a job, people severely underestimate how difficult it is. They also overestimate the kind of wage they can get when they find a job. And then we know a lot about loss aversion or reference dependence. That's sort of how people evaluate their current situation depends on how they view their past, and they do these comparisons. All of these are essentially features that we could build into models to understand human behavior in the context of unemployment insurance. There's a second approach, which I would call the nudge-based approach, and nudges is something that will come up a lot today, I think, which is that we can try to sort of use insights from psychology to sort of encourage people to change their behavior in small ways, and often in ways like changing defaults or changing standards. This one way, and in this context, we can think about providing people additional motivation to look for a job, sending them text message reminders that today it's a really good day to look for a job because there are a lot of vacancies out there. And that's sort of a second approach, which is a bit more where we just kind of run experiments and see what happens. So what I'm going to talk about today in this project is following more the first approach, but I think there's a lot of promising research in the second. And the UK nudge unit is actually doing some interesting work on this right now, and I think there's more potential for that maybe in the US as well. So what we are doing in this project is we take one of the most well-documented insights from psychology and behavioral economics, and in some ways maybe one of the starting points of behavioral economics, namely reference dependence. And that's the idea that people evaluate their current situation relative to the recent past, which we call here the reference point. So consider an individual who faces the decision, how hard do I search for a job? And what kind of jobs should I accept? Now, that decision and how hard to search for a job will depend on how they evaluate their current situation, as well as on the perceived payoff of finding a job. Now, in the standard framework that we sort of used to use to analyze this decision, the past does not typically matter. And the only thing that really matters is what's your current situation, like what's your current level of unemployment benefits, as well as what's the future benefit of finding a job, namely the the potential wage you can get if you get a job offer. But with reference dependence, potentially it can be very important where you're coming from. So if you're used to a very high income level, if your benefits currently are very low, you're really unhappy. But it can also be that sort of over time, maybe you're kind of getting used to a lower income level. And in this paper, we're exploring what are the potential implications from that. So consider a very typical way how unemployment benefits are designed. And this is roughly true for the US, but also for most other countries around the globe. So typically you have some level of benefits, which you receive for a certain fixed amount of period. Right? So in the US, sort of, when we're not in a recession, this is typically 26 weeks of UI benefits, and after that you just don't get any UI benefits. You might still be getting something like food stamps. So in this case, you sort of have a certain level of benefits, and then after you exhaust your benefits, this drops to a lower level. And let's briefly sort of think through what this might mean in the more standard model for people's behavior, as well as if we take this idea of reference dependence seriously. So the standard model would predict something like the following for how people should search for a job. So if at the beginning you lose your job, you actually still know you have your benefits for, in the US, 26 weeks, so you're not in such a rush to find a job. But the closer you get to this point where you exhaust your benefits, the harder you're going to look for a job, because you know if I don't find a job very soon, then I'm going to be really unhappy because my benefits will drop. Now consider a situation where people evaluate their current situation to their recent past. In this case, this might be quite different. So somebody who just lost their job, they are sort of used to a pretty high income level. Right? They're paying, they receive their wage. UI benefits are substantially less, usually about 50% or so. And compared to that, they're really unhappy. But then over time, they're sort of slowly getting adjusted to having less money. But maybe they're also adjusting in ways that they have to sell their expensive, inefficient car. They're getting sort of a cheap car or use the bus. So they may sort of change in a variety of ways, and they're sort of becoming more content with that situation. And because of that, their search effort actually declines over time. But now they're facing this prospect, soon I will lose my benefits again, right? I'm reaching the 26 weeks, and they're starting to search really hard again. Then at some point, their benefits expired, and they exhaust them. And they now have to make do with sort of even less income. Maybe their spouse still makes some money. Maybe they have other forms of having a little bit of income. And they sort of then, again, get used to this even lower level of benefits. So the simple implication from this kind of reference-dependent model looks very different from the standard model. But note that it's possible that the standard model could potentially explain something that looks more like like what you see on the right-hand side, if there's a lot of heterogeneity of people, very different people searching sort of at different times, and the pool of who's unemployed is changing over time. So this alone, just looking at actual empirical job finding rates may not be enough to really disentangle the two. And so what we're doing here is looking at a situation where the benefits path in Hungary, which is the country we're looking at, changed in this way where they basically front-loaded the benefits. So rather than having these constant benefits for the entire time period, they have higher benefits at the beginning, then they drop to a lower level. And then in Hungary, this was after 9 months, so this the final drop where all the benefits drop to a lower level. Now in this kind of situation, the predictions between the two models are quite different. So the standard model would say, well, if the benefits are higher initially, we should just search even harder initially, because soon there will be this very large drop. And then we sort of approach the old benefit path. But after the drop in both benefits, the job finding probability should be the same in the old and in the new system. And we see the opposite with the reference dependent model, but in particular in this time period that we see right there, we actually see that under the reference dependent model in the old system, when people come from this really generous or relatively generous benefit path, we should see a higher job finding probability. And this is exactly what we're looking at in the reform that happened in Hungary. Let me just show you this, where I'm showing you the red path, which was after this reform, moving to a two-step system, and the blue path was before the reform. And you see precisely that in the old system, where people had these relatively high benefits up to, for the first 9 months, we see that after the benefits in the old and the new systems on the same level, in the old system, the probability of finding a job was substantially higher than it was before. And we sort of go through sort of some very careful modeling to show that not only does this sort of qualitatively fit, but even quantitatively we can actually estimate a model, we can estimate all of these parameters, and we can show that a model with reference dependence, which is here on the right-hand side, provides a much better explanation of what is going on around this reform than the more standard search model that people used to use in the past. Let me just conclude. So there's certainly a range of behavioral factors that matter for job search, and we can think about incorporating them into our models and what they help us in terms of understanding how people search for jobs. And what I showed you today was mostly focusing on one of these aspects, but this one had sort of was surprisingly successful to us in providing an explanation for these patterns that we see in this particular Hungarian UI reform. And Hungary was a little bit unique in the sense that most countries don't have reforms that look like this, but we think it's very interesting to test this in other contexts. And this opens up the possibility of redesigning UI systems in a way that take this sort of insight into account, how people search for jobs. And in particular, it suggests that having these several step downs may be very efficient, sort of inducing people to search harder early on in the system. And in particular, in the Hungarian system, it's interesting that the way they redesigned this, it made the system essentially more generous for everybody, because depending on when you found a job, you always got at least as many benefits as in the old system. But people searched so much harder for jobs initially that UI system overall actually saved quite a bit of money. So it made the system more generous and it saved money, which is what we usually think is not possible, that usually there's a trade-off between having additional transfers and the small hazard that sort of disincentivize people from finding a job. Thank you very much.
All of the speakers can join us. Getting a shot.
Feels a bit like
I know, okay. Great. So thank you very much. There was a lot of really incredibly interesting stuff in all three papers. I just want to remind people that most of the papers are available on the slides on our website if you want to go back and try to figure out all the details. I'm going to try to focus on sort of bigger picture stuff and following up on what I mentioned in the introduction, what Raj said, which is what are the broad implications of some of this stuff. So let me start with you, Olivia. So you looked at the determinants of the magnitude of behavior in general, and you found these sort of pretty big behavioral effects. I was wondering if you had thought about sort of finding people who didn't change, didn't respond at all, and finding who did, and kind of what do we think of the fraction of people we should be thinking as sort of homo economicus and when our models are right, and what fraction are just really, very different? And one of the things I would have worried about if you say, well, we're going to offer people a choice, is that you'd have incredible adverse selection problems, that people would think they'd be rational, and if you're going to live a long time, you would not take the lump sum. So I'm just wondering how you think we should rethink these things.
Well, so I think that the experiment that we did was only an experiment. That is, we asked people, what would you do under the status quo, and what would you do under these alternatives? We have seen in the health and retirement study that what people say they will do lines up pretty well with what they do. So that gives us a little bit of comfort. What we're not doing in the experiment is saying to people, would you like a lump sum or not? We're simply saying, if the world was such where you had a lump sum to delay claiming, would you delay claiming? So we're not really allowing adverse selection between the two different worlds, and I think that's important. We did have a lot of information on people, a variety of aspects about the people. So for example, were they in good or poor health? Because you might think that people that are in poor health might prefer a lump sum because they might not live long enough. So we controlled on that. We controlled on whether people were particularly liquidity constrained, whether they had big debt, a lot of credit card debt, and so forth. And that didn't actually make much of a difference, so we were surprised. We controlled on political risk, people's perception of how likely it was that the Social Security system might not pay off as promised. And actually, the people that were more confident didn't want the lump sum, which makes sense because they're happy to keep on with the annuity. But I think, you know, the broader question is, do people correctly understand longevity risk? Do they correctly understand the benefits of having longevity protection? And I think that's a really hard problem. And in fact, in the health and retirement study, if you look at people projecting their probability of living, say that if they're 65 to 75, they're about accurate. They're really inaccurate if you look at the probability of surviving to 85 and 95. And women are the most pessimistic. That is, women tend to understate systematically their probability of living long, meaning they don't really understand the value of an annuity. So there's a lot of research that we can do to push on that point.
So let me ask you a question, Naomi, similar too. So, you know, there's been a lot of attention recently on dynamically scoring tax proposals, Sir Jim Bush's tax proposal. Mm-hmm. All of those models assume that people understand marginal tax rates, they respond to marginal tax rates. So do you think that, you know, your work suggests that we really need to rethink that? And if so, like, in what directions do we think this makes the tax system less distortionary, more distortionary, or are there things that we should be doing to the tax system to try to make it less distortionary?
Right, so it's difficult to say what to do when you're talking about taxpayer confusion. It can go both ways. So I gave an example of where we should not have seen any distortion at all, looking at lump sum change, and then we actually see people responding. But you could think of the flip side, that when we're moving around marginal tax rates, it could be that people are partially attributing this to lump sum changes, and so it's less distortionary than what we might expect based upon current sort of knowledge on elasticities with labor supply and things along those lines. So it's really hard to say in which direction this should be going. There seems to be some evidence based upon this work and work of others that actually education and learning could help people understand more of how they should be responding properly to the tax code. So that's one potential way to go, is sort of straightforward, you know, educating people, saying, you know, listen, when you lose this credit, there's absolutely no impact on your marginal tax rate, you know, don't think there should be. I've noticed actually over the years, and Olivia sort of mentioned to me, talking about tax advisors and things along those lines. So you can think about tax advisors as sort of distinct from sort of your H&R Block or perhaps your TurboTax. So if something like a tax advisor could be actually quite useful. So if you're thinking, this is what happened to me this year, how should I be responding in sort of my future labor supply or other actions? That's very different than ex post trying to just figure out what minimize your marginal tax rates. So tax advising, learning could definitely be beneficial in this case.
Also, I think that's an interesting question, which is yes and no, right? If we think that people, when educated, have all these other biases and make wrong choices, you sort of want to tell them about the things that will keep them in the labor or do the things that you want, and not tell them about the stuff that's going to make them distort their behavior, right? So you're sort of left with this, you know, just, I think as you pointed out, you know, until we can understand the utility, it makes it just really complicated to say anything.
I mean, I would just add that, you know, in the case of, let's say, increasing marginal tax rates, it could be very well that you do not want to actually let people know what you're doing, because in that case it would be distortionary, and so you might just want to hide it actually. So it really depends on whether you want to encourage or discourage the behavior.
Right. All right, Johannes. So what I was really curious about, I thought your results were really fascinating, right? So you found that people respond to changes in their income more than the level of income, which brings up a whole question of how we do distributional analysis. But what I was actually kind of curious is I thought they were so surprising. How did the Hungarian government think that this would happen? Like, how did they know?
So that's a good question. So I'm not Hungarian, but two of my co-authors are Hungarian. What they've been telling me, I mean, there was sort of a new government. They did a couple of other changes, sort of unrelated to the UI system. And it's hard to know what exactly they had in mind. I mean, it seems like they sort of wanted to reward people who find a job quickly. I mean, in some ways, the system does that, right? It's sort of, if you find a job within 3 months, you get much more than you got under the old system. if it takes you 9 months, you get more or less the same. And somehow they had this idea, okay, maybe people will find jobs faster. I think, and maybe that's not totally surprising that we find it. I think the degree to what this happens and that it actually saved money, that's actually quite surprising. So that the beneficial effect of reducing the incentives for staying unemployed longer so far outweighed the actual cost of doing that. And I mean, the way we view this is that it's really interesting testing ground for this reference dependence. It suggests that this kind of policy reform could be beneficial in other contexts as well. But there may also be other ways where you can sort of use the fact that people seem to respond to perceived changes in the situation quite a bit, right? So we talked to the NUT unit in the UK recently, and after seeing our paper, they said they've been thinking a lot about this over the last month. So they saw this a while ago, and they started, or they're going to start an experiment very soon where they just call the first, I think, 3 months of unemployment an occupational transition phase. And they tell people, look, you're not unemployed, you're in an occupational transition, but only for 3 months, and then you're going to be unemployed. Right? So nothing changes in terms of the unemployment benefits in this case, right? But it still makes it very salient that after 3 months, something is happening. And so they're running this as an experiment, and I'm extremely curious to see what they will find. And maybe they won't see an effect, but if they do, this would certainly be very exciting. And
So actually, let me ask you the other question too, which is, does this mean that the way we do analysis of the distributional impacts of policies is really misplaced, or are these adjustments fast enough that we're still kind of getting it right by just looking at sort of the dollars that are going to different people, as opposed to the changes they're experiencing and the disutility from those?
I mean, as a first order approximation, I think the way we've been doing this is probably reasonable, but I fully agree with Raj's statement that it's kind of at an early stage for really understanding how this changes our welfare analysis, and it potentially could change it quite a bit, but it gets very quickly very complex. And I don't think we have either enough of an empirical understanding how people actually make these decisions, and then there are difficult normative questions about how to treat them, right? And if people themselves sort of have inconsistent behavior, and hyperbolic discounting is one example we talked a bit about, but David Leibson has done a lot of work on, raise a lot of difficult questions. If you would make different decisions, if you're looking in the future, than if you do them right now, then it's very difficult. What's the right decision here? Right? If people sort of can't even be within themselves consistent, and I don't think we have fully reached consensus about what to do about this.
Raj, do you have any questions before we open up to the floor for our speakers?
Two thoughts. So one, Olivia, in the context of your work, which I found very interesting, one thing that struck me is there's another behavioral effect at play, which is arguably why we had Social Security annuity benefits rather than giving people a lump sum, which is we're worried that people will spend the lump sum and not have enough money at older ages. So this is sort of, while it's useful in one direction from a behavioral perspective, it enhances another behavioral anomaly. And so I was wondering if you've thought about how to trade that off at all.
Well, I think that, economists for years have gone on saying you really ought to protect during retirement, protect against running out of money. And the only way to do that is with some kind of lifetime annuity. And so then there's been an industry amongst those of us in the room and elsewhere about trying to figure out why people don't do it. And so I think that question is still very much on the table. That's one of the reasons when we designed this experiment, we didn't let people cash out their entire lump sum, their entire benefit to take a lump sum, because we do worry about the bass boat phenomenon, people going out and buying a fishing boat and then not having anything left at the end of the day. When I served on the Social Security Commission back in 2001, there were a range of different political views, but everybody said you still have to make sure that people will get some sort of an annuity for exactly this reason. Otherwise, folks are going to go out and blow it. And they're going to come back with their hands out asking for welfare once again. So I think that balance is where we're trying to strike the happy medium.
And then just one other thought. So in the context of Louise's question on dynamic scoring of policy proposals, one implication of some of this work is that CBO might actually want to use a different forecasting model, right, for scoring alternative policy proposals, where it's not just conventional labor supply models with an elasticity that you plug in, but you incorporate some considerations of inattention or confusion and so forth. And so I don't know how radical a proposal that is. I think someone like Peter would have a better sense of whether that might actually be on the horizon, but I think that's the implication of some of this work for policy proposals.
Okay, we'll open it up to the floor for questions. Can you stand up, state your name, and tell us where you're from? Or don't stand up because the mics are on.
Use the mic.
Henry.
Can you use the mic, because I can't hear you?
It's on now?
Yeah.
Good. I'm very sympathetic with the experiment and the option that you are working with. In fact, I got two Stanford psychologists to carry out a very informal experiment on exactly the same trade-off that you investigated, and they came up, it wasn't nearly as good or complete a study as yours, but it came up with conclusions not dissimilar to your own. But in thinking about possible reasons why people indicated the choices, made the choices that they did, there's one other possibility for why they did, and it's that they're innumerate. Basically not able in a rational way to weigh a very large lump sum, a discounted lifetime present value, against a monthly benefit. I'm wondering whether you tried comparing annual benefits with the discounted present value to see whether the results were the same.
That's a really good idea. We did not. However, we were able to control on people's financial literacy measured by the big three questions that Anna Maria Luzardi and I have looked at over the years and that are now included in the PISA test, the high school test, being implemented around the world. So we'll pretty soon find out if our high school kids are knowledgeable or not. I fear not. And what we see in that work and some other work with Jeff Brown is that people who are more financially literate, even controlling in some studies on IQ, just people who understand interest rates, that understand inflation, that understand risk diversification, those people make a much more smooth comparison of the annuity and the lump sum. It is the financially less knowledgeable that just really don't get the fact that one can be converted into the other. So it's a very good point.
David Laibson from Harvard.
Am I on? Is this
You're
okay?
on.
Great. You know, I also worry about giving people an out from the annuity. There's one other element that I want to throw into the mix, which is the externality societally that comes when people have annuities, because it enables them to have income late in life that pays for things like medical co-payments and long-term care. And of course, if they don't have that income or they have less of it, more of that late life burden falls on the public purse through Medicaid. So it's just one more reason, not just the internal problem that people may not understand the benefits of the annuity, but also the external benefit that we all experience by having people hold annuities.
That's a really good point. And I think that's why some countries like Singapore, where we were the last time I saw you, have actually said at retirement or at 55, you must buy yourself a subsistence annuity benefit. And after that, you can take the rest of your cash. But I think that's kind of the logic we have here. The other point I would make, and this is going back to the earlier comments, is that if you survey financial advisors, over and over again, you find out they don't really know what they're talking about. And we'll get to this as well later. So for example, something like 76% of financial advisors believe you should take your Social Security benefit as soon as possible without any conditionality whatsoever. Why? Because they use a break-even analysis. They say if you delay taking your benefit by a year, then you'll get a higher benefit later, but you'll have to live 14 more years for sure to get to break even. And what they don't understand is this totally discards the notion of insurance and protection against longevity risk. So we need to educate those who advise us as well as the participants in the programs themselves.
I have another question sort of following up on that, which is, so there is the sense that if you went to lump sum, you are actually losing the ability in some way of changing the benefits later. So if we think about the insolvency of, like, if we went to a chain CPI or something, you would get less bang for the buck once you've already sort of given away the benefits. So, sort of on the other side of people not trusting the system, perhaps,
It could be. I mean, we're still proposing that there'll be some level of benefit to protect against people running out of money, but obviously, right.
Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, great. I had a question for Johannes. One thing I thought is there might be another type of
Keep pushing it.
pushing it.
Yeah.
Okay. No? All right. So, kind of the earlier you start the job search when you're unemployed, probably your chances of finding another job looks better also, not just because of your own, internal psychology, but how the world responds to you, right? Somebody who's out of a job for several months versus just recently probably is more attractive to an employer too, and therefore the responses that you get from the world when you search intensively at the beginning are probably more positive, right, than later in the job search process. And I wonder whether that's something that also helps here in your findings. So what happens actually is not just kind of the backward-looking idea that your reference point is different, but actually that the day-to-day, in a way, feedback that you get when you intensively search is just more positive when time drags on. And therefore, kind of when you have these early incentives, as you had in Hungary, whether that makes a difference. And one way, kind of, I thought you could potentially look at it is whether the type of jobs that then people look for are different. I don't know whether you see that. We did a study in France where, they changed the unemployment system slightly differently, but there we see big shifts to self-employment and people starting, kind of their own little firms. And I wonder whether that's something that happened in Hungary too.
Yes, I think it's most likely true that the return to searching is higher early on in your unemployment spell. We've done a different study in Germany where we argue we can actually measure sort of how much worse employment prospects get throughout the unemployment duration, and just within 1 year, sort of the wage people can get seems to fall by about 10% or so. And so there's certainly a pretty substantial cost of being unemployed for a long time. And from the policymaker's perspective, if you can get people to maybe understand that better and search earlier hard is, I think, a good idea. And in some ways, that may certainly magnify why we find these sort of big returns to encouraging the search earlier on, because that's really when you get the most bang for the buck. And I think there's intuitively plausible, as well as there's some empirical evidence that once people are really long-term unemployed, it gets very hard for them to find a job. And that may be either because they are very depressed and they may really lose skills, or it could be this idea of statistical discrimination from the employer side. We look a little bit at what are the kind of jobs people take on in Hungary before and after this reform, and there's relatively little one can see in the data. In wages, for example, is a relatively noisy measure here, and we don't see much in terms of the type of jobs people take on. But I think that I'm very sympathetic to that interpretation.
Yes?
Okay, Harvey Galfer at the Urban Institute. I have a question, but I'd like to ask it of Rav Chetty. So my first question is not a legitimate question.
Fine.
Assuming it is. On the tax issue, I'm interested in whether you looked at the effect perhaps of the use of tax preparers as being a factor in determining whether people were knowledgeable about the EITC.
Right, so there are definitely large tax preparer effects. So some of the areas where you see the biggest response to the EITC are places with the largest penetration of companies like H&R Block. Now, it's difficult to figure out cause and effect there because H&R Block also tends to locate its offices in areas with large numbers of EITC filers. And those are also the places where we think knowledge is spreading from people communicating with each other. But our sense is tax preparers are facilitating the communication of this information. And moreover, we haven't investigated this directly ourselves, but it could be done in the future. I think there's substantial differences across tax preparers, where some tax preparers provide more knowledge or different knowledge relative to others, coming back to the point that was just made about the advisors really mattering in this space.
So I had a question for Naomi. So I was just wondering, do you have the statistical power to characterize the magnitude of the distortion or the level of confusion at the geographic level? And if you have looked at something like that, I'm wondering if that map parallels kind of what Raj has found in his EITC work, which would suggest that kind of this knowledge is, it might not be domain specific even within the tax code.
So that sounds very interesting. We didn't look at geographic variation, but it definitely sounds very interesting. And I mean, again, it's just under 1 million observations, so it's hard to say off the bat what kind of statistical power we would have based upon what size we break it down, but we didn't try that yet.
I have a question for you too, and another one, which is, how do you know that it's taxpayer confusion versus could it be some kind of nudge effect as well? The federal government is telling you that your child is now old enough to go get a job. They're child enough to work, that you could now relax because your kid's an adult. And so perhaps it is that kind of effect as opposed to someone calculating their taxes.
So that's a very good point. Some of the details that I brushed over is that we were very careful to make sure that December and January birth households were in the same year of high school. So we got rid of all states. For example, December 31st would have been a cutoff because we were very concerned about this idea of children leaving for college. That could definitely have implications for parental labor supply, for the child's labor supply. So kids in this case are definitely in the same grade. And they're still minors, they're still 17. And another reason why we also didn't want to say, well, does this effect perhaps persist into future years, is that at that point, again, they're turning 18, they're leaving potentially for college. Then they're losing the child deduction at 19, perhaps the EITC. So these are all very, very good questions. Our setup is just not very conducive to answering them, just because once you start moving it forward a year or two, you get into all of these other issues. And hopefully 17 is still slightly young enough such that they're not expected to start, supporting the family when they turn that. But 18 is a very different age. So we're lucky actually that this happens to be the one credit that we're aware of that actually happens at 17 and not 18, 19 or beyond.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much for a great panel. Carrie is going to
to get your lunch and bring it back here. If you're joining us via webcast, sit tight. We'll be back in about 15 minutes.
go get your lunch.
Thanks.
So, Carrie, when is Maya going to speak? When?
Oh, yeah.
Maya Shankar is going to be speaking in about 20 minutes,
Right,
starting
so-
back up here.
So it's a buffet line across the street. Bring it back in here.
Not across the street, just the
Right,
hall.
across the hall.
All we have to do is go across the hall. There's going to be 4 lines, so we can hopefully move through pretty quickly. Bring it back, find a seat, talk to your neighbor. We'll get started again soon. Thanks.
Good.